Hey everyone, Jeff Manchester, Manchester Music. Welcome. This is the second post in a vlog series that I started when I was in Chicago, just traveling all the time. And I started this series because there's some questions that were sort of meant for the vodcast, but they couldn't really be explored in a vodcast sort of context. They were too interesting or complicated to be explored in a YouTube comment. So that's why I made this vlog thing. So today we're going to be diving into a really amazing question that was asked of me in the comments of a YouTube video that I just love. And it's one of those questions where someone asks you and you're like, oh, it's you like double take yourself and your brain. You're like, actually, it's way more complicated and complex than that. So I'm going to show you the question that was asked. It was asked on the Anatomy of a Cue Libraries Used video that I did in August. And the question was asked by Corso. He says, nice track. I'll play the track in a minute so there's some context here. He asks, would you agree that this form of scoring is more like sound design or effects collage? Do you think anyone with the right tools could achieve the same results? What about the risks of sounding repetitive or similar to the next composer? I mean, it feels way more restrained and finite. You have to rely 95% on the samples you own to create a track like that, instead of writing for orchestra in a traditional sense. So this was a very smartly worded question. It just struck all the right tone. It wasn't like adversarial, or he wasn't like, you know, saying a lot of people are just like, it's just MIDI or whatever. It's way more complicated than that. And so it merits, I think, a very complicated answer. And I don't think I have one, but I just kind of want to ruminate on what it means to be composing with samples and what it means to be sort of composing in 2017. So I'm going to play the song that he's referring to. It's a track that I think I called Silent Up Until Now. I'll just play it from the halfway point, just so you guys can sort of get in your heads what this person is talking about. So there we go. I'll just play it from here. Just have a listen. All right, so let's just unpack this question, which has really been on my mind ever since I first read it. So he starts by saying, nice track. Thank you, Corso. So would I agree that this form of scoring is more like a sound design or effects collage? Now, I think on its face, this is the kind of question that could be interpreted as almost insulting, but you know, because it's not like John Williams or Hans Zimmer or something. But in fact, I find this to be a very flattering kind of question, because the pointillistic approach that we're hearing in this particular track is the sort of style that feels very familiar to me. It's a percussive style, in that we just have sort of very quickly attacked clusters of notes that sort of form. It's almost like a bunch of birds flying all around in a big swarm, and they all sort of maintain this incredible shape that just moves and all this stuff. It's not a very neatly sort of formed, sequenced pattern of notes that leads up to something that sounds like something that we can sort of hum in our heads. It's more the sum of this huge textured thing that just kind of moves and shakes and shifts into some sort of big blobby melody instead. And that's kind of the vibe that I always try and go for, that I always hear in scores that really inspire me and in songs that I sort of come up with. So I don't think that this is a sound design or effects collage, but it could be argued that it kind of is. It's not very rudimentary or traditional in the sense that, you know, again, I hate to be using John Williams all the time, but it's not John Williams. And a lot of people, for them, that's what film music is. Film music is John Williams. And it's only John Williams, or it's John Williams and variants thereof, or whatever. I have always felt like that kind of music just doesn't really interest me or excite me. Maybe when I was a child, it was very interesting and delightful. But now, as I get a bit older, I just sort of want something a bit more droney and textured And this could be why I don't get tons and tons of jobs as a composer for film, the kind of films that maybe people are used to. I get more sort of artsy fartsy stuff, which I love because I get to express myself in this way that is more of a sound design or effects collage than a traditional sort of score a la John Williams. That kind of composing doesn't interest me, and I found I learned really quickly that if I'm not making something or writing something that I really enjoy or really like doing, the music suffers, the scene and the movie suffers, and also I just suffer. It's just kind of depressing for me. I did one film where it was more of a challenge than anything, and it was an exciting challenge for me to write outside of my own kind of style, if I have one, and that was I Fub You. It was this movie that had a very sort of Pixar-y feel, and for me, I just love the story and the vibe so much of that short film that I was happy to try and write for it. The sort of Danny Elfman sort of, it's hard to explain. You just have to go watch it, or there's some interviews that I did online or whatever. It's just very delicate, almost romantic sort of orchestral music that I came up with for that. But I'm more comfortable doing this sort of drony Johan Johansson stuff and the Trent Reznor stuff and all that. And basically anyone that came from a sort of non-traditional composing background and is now in film and doing film music, I'm always very drawn to their sort of work. So on the first area, would you agree this form of scoring is more like sound design, effects, or collage? I don't know. I have no idea, but obviously that's how some people are perceiving it, and for that reason, maybe you're right. Maybe it's more of a sound design thing, and I'm not in the traditional sort of cluster of composers that we're used to hearing, and I'm okay with that. And if someone can't easily categorize or maybe misinterprets the genre that you're aiming for, it's probably a good thing that they don't think that you are like X, Y, or Z, or you are like chicken or like beef or something else. The next thing that he says is, do you think anyone with the right tools could achieve the same results? Obviously, we're all using sample libraries here, so if anyone has these tools, they could ostensibly come up with the exact same thing. That being said, you know, I live in Toronto where there's a big sort of Chinatown Chinese community. They're all using the same ingredients. They're all cooking with the same stuff, but the order in which they introduce those ingredients, how long they stay in the pot, when they're seasoned, what gets seasoned, what doesn't. They're working with the same stuff, but you can go to any restaurant and you will have some people who swear by the pho at this Vietnamese restaurant, even though the same ingredients, noodles, scallops, going crazy. Anyone who loves pho would be cringing right now. Noodles, scallions, or green onions or whatever. You know, you've got your basil in there, and you've got your broth, which is full of like 20 plus chemicals and ingredients, amazing stuff. All those things come together in this really amazing way, but will taste differently from restaurant to restaurant to restaurant. The same thing with, like, I don't know, like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich maybe is a good example. Some people might toast the bread, some people might not. You might go for a crunchy or smooth peanut butter, or an organic or peanut butter, something like that, or some weird jam. It's all the same stuff, but the way that it's all put together can lead to something really different and sort of differentiating, even though the ingredients are all the same. This kind of leads into your other question about, you know, what are the risks of sounding repetitive or similar to the next composer? That's something that I think no one should ever worry about. But if you're stealing not a melody, but maybe a vibe, that is probably the direction that you want to go in. And obviously the risk for sounding like someone else, maybe another composer that maybe is emerging like yourself or something, not a super established person, because they have a wider palette from which to sort of create, that goes up, you know, because we are all using sample libraries, probably the same ones. But the good news is that we get to use them in an environment that is not a hall or, you know, an orchestra space or floor or whatever. We get to use them in a computer where we can manipulate and tweak and change things. I was talking to Keegan DeWitt. He's a composer. He's done a lot of work on HBO and a lot of work with David Lowery. No, not that's someone else. Not Keegan DeWitt, but another Keegan DeWitt, HBO. We talked on the channel on a vodcast. A lot of his work is done pretty much all in the box, and one of his favorite things about being in the box, and it's such a misnomer, in the box, is that we have the ability to manipulate and transform our samples and mangle things in a way that maybe so-and-so has not thought of with the same Spitfire library. So maybe, you know, it can go through some sort of intense Ableton processing where we're stretching things, we're shifting things, we're buffer shuffling things, and even though we're using the same samples, they sound totally different depending on the processing that they've been through, but they are the same basic ingredients. So, but I think when you start to play the game of, like, do I sound like that person? Does that person sound like me? Oh, my friend on this forum bought the same library, and I know that he or she is, like, gunning for the same job as me. I better make sure that I use, like, you know, a Sonokinetic library or something for my mock-ups. Like, you know, that's... You'll never win. You'll never, ever, ever win that argument. Just go and compose, cross your fingers, and just make your art. Stop worrying about what the other person next to you is doing. It feels way more restrained, he says, of my track in finite. Maybe that's what he means, of my track. I'm not sure. You have to rely 95% on the samples you own to create a track like that, instead of writing for orchestra in a traditional sense. This is one of the questions I don't fully understand. I guess what he's saying is he thinks that I have less colors to choose from, or less sort of crayons in the box of crayons that I use to create my art. Again, I don't feel like that's true, because I mean, I know what he's saying, because in this example, I was particularly making use of one of the Spitfire libraries. I can't remember which one it was, but libraries from Spitfire. I mean, you've heard the examples on their website, and I don't think they mess around. I think when they're showing you, this came all from the box from, Orchestral Swarm, which I just sort of did a first look on the channel. When they do those sort of things, I don't think they're messing with you and they're using other stuff. They're just using that library. That speaks to the versatility and density of capability in those libraries. It's phenomenal what you can do with just those colors, if you will. It's sort of, I have this weird analogy, but remember going to camp, anyone? And you would go to camp and you would be like, oh, who am I going to be friends with, or like maybe who's hot or who's not hot or whatever. It's the weirdest thing. But after the more time you spend with people at camp, they just end up looking different after a month or a couple of weeks. Hopefully this makes sense to someone, but you're in a class with a bunch of new people, maybe it's school, maybe it's camp, and you sort of sum them up and you're like, okay, whatever. And then after a while, they kind of reveal themselves to you in different ways, and suddenly they just look different. People just look different after a while, and they're this whole other person under there that you didn't perceive of the very first time that you met them. That's what these sample libraries are like to me when I get them. They're kind of like kids at camp. This is weird. I play with the patches and I try them out. The more time I spend with them, the more different and unique they sound, and the more they sort of start to get their own voice and their own individuality, and I find different ways to, let's ditch the kids at camp metaphor, use them in different contexts and stuff like that. So the first impression is, oh, this is maybe not that helpful to me, or, oh, I'm not going to use that. But the more you spend digging and playing with it, the more I think it becomes something else entirely, and they kind of reveal themselves to be useful in different contexts and all the rest of it. I think that's what Corso was talking about in this last section of the question. I'm not totally sure. On the topic of instead of writing for orchestra in a traditional sense, this is one of the sort of pain points for people, and I still see people struggling with this one. And by struggling, I mean a lot of people think that it's maybe inauthentic or cheating to be using samples, not just to create mock-ups, but to create the entire score. They feel like these sample libraries are meant for mock-ups, which then get translated by an orchestrator into notes, or through some sort of program that translates the MIDI into notes, and then it goes to an orchestrator, and then it goes to an orchestra. Again, Keegan DeWitt writes for HBO all the time. Anyone who writes for television, a lot of that stuff never leaves the box. So Spitfire, I'm not just picking on Spitfire, Sonokinetic, all those companies or whatever, their stuff is used heavily in the box from A to Z. The whole thing is done in the box. It's just their abilities as mixers and mastering engineers and arrangers, in addition to being composers, that allows them to present to a producer or a director a really beautifully sounding finished product that might fool an audience into thinking that it came from a real sort of live floor. Pretty much in Hollywood and maybe video games, although I don't know the video game market, but Hollywood definitely for movies, things seldom go to picture that are only a mock-up. Usually that stuff goes in the hands of an orchestrator, and then it gets put to a page, and then you walk into Air Studios or somewhere like that in England, and you have an orchestra playing what you've essentially started in MIDI. But in television, timelines are tight. You do not have the time to send that stuff out. You don't have the money. You don't have the budget. Of course, everyone would love to just go to East West and hear their stuff lifted off the ground by an incredible amount of players and all the rest of it. But that's just not the way it is. We've reached peak television, so we are at this point now where things start on the hard disk, and then they leave the hard disk and they go to the re-recording mixer, who basically takes your stuff and places it amongst the ambiences and dialogue and sound effects and Foley, and then bounces it all down into one stereo mix, or a 5.1, 7.1 Atmos mix for TV. I'm not really sure if they do a lot of Atmos mixes for TV. Maybe they would for a DVD, and then it goes to the market. It doesn't go to actual players. That's why people spend a lot of money on Spitfire or Vienna or orchestral tools and stuff. So don't feel like you are not worthy or not a good composer or something because everything is staying in the box. That's for the majority of media work these days, where things live and die. A lot of these samples that come out that we pay so much money for are just that good, and if you know what you're doing, you can really come up with something absolutely beautiful. And I've heard the expression like, samples sound great, but the real thing is better, blah blah blah, and all that stuff. Like, audiences, like, that stuff matters to us as composers. That stuff matters to us and only us. If you play your mock-ups and you know what you're doing, whatever, people just get invested and engrossed in the film, in the movie. If the soundtrack, if your music that came from a box is really terrible, it will probably pull them out of the story and make them go, does that sound fake? But most of the time, the only ones worrying if, oh, my in-the-box mix, is it good enough, is us. That's the only people who give a shit about that stuff. So Christian Henson was saying, he's like, I recorded this triple felt thing because I like to record all my own stuff. And now we're all making our cues with the triple felt piano. So, he recorded, his whole company recorded all these beautiful players playing these amazing passages and all this stuff. Does it not make sense that we would use a Spitfire library in the same way that we would use a triple felt? Like, it just becomes a library. It just becomes a tool. It becomes an instrument, And what is an instrument if not something that makes a sound when you press down on it, like MIDI? Like, you press a piano, it makes a sound. You press a MIDI keyboard, it makes a sound. It's an instrument, as far as I'm concerned. So let's just get over this idea that, we're not real composers, or we're not part of, like, the club. We don't have the tattoo just because we don't walk in with an orchestrator to a huge room where we sort of, help conduct some, like, 70-piece orchestra. It's just not the way it is. But like, what do you guys think? Do you guys get the chance to go into big studios and record people? How do you guys feel about doing mock-ups? How do you feel about doing everything in the box? Do you do a lot of stuff in the box? Do you find that there's limitations to what you can do with a Spitfire library or an orchestral tools library, or even, like, something a little more sort of on the affordable side, like maybe something from Native Instruments, like in the factory library stuff? Let me know in the comments. I'm, like, genuinely interested to see what you guys have to say about that. So thanks for watching. Jeff Manchester. Yeah, take care.